Welcome to the Exercising Health Podcast, a show dedicated to making health science simple. In this first episode, I interviewed Dr. Peter Francis, an expert in sports rehabilitation and human gait biomechanics. In the discussion, we explore how the patterns of physical activities have changed drastically over time and the effects that this has on our health and athletic performance. We look at the benefits of barefoot running and minimalistic footwear for injury prevention, why elite athletes like Eliad Kipchoge are such high performers, and finally, Dr. Francis's suggestions for the top 7 things to include in your running program. For a summary of this interview, including links to all the studies and products mentioned in this episode, visit exercisinghealth.net/podcast or follow the links provided in the description of this video. Anyway, that's it for now. Enjoy the show. Dr. Francis, hi, can you hear me?
Hi, how are you?
All right, and yourself?
Good.
Okay, so thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on the show. A little bit of a background. I've long been a strong advocate for barefoot running, and it was actually how I came across your work in my research, which I found to be very informative, by the way. Maybe we can start by you briefly describing how you came to focus some of your research on this topic, as well as your background as a researcher.
I came to it really through experience. I was a keen runner since I was 15, really, and I started to pick up a lot of injuries. And I was in the Middle East teaching English after I finished my first degree when I was 23, and I got plantar fasciitis. I'd spend a lot of money getting a lot of treatment and so on. But the way my work schedule was over there and the way society as a whole was over there, it wasn't so easy to get access to treatment. And so a friend of mine at home just sent me a magazine article about barefoot running and said, "Have you seen this?" So I found the only grass park that there is in Qatar, and I went there and I ran for 15 minutes. I did it twice and my plantar fasciitis was gone. And so I came back from the Middle East to Ireland to do my PhD. And I said to my professor, "Hey, this amazing thing happened to me in the Middle East." And he kind of threw his eyes to heaven and he was like, "All right." But he said, "Look, you can work with one of my undergrad students to investigate whatever it is you want to look at." So we took the arm off the treadmill, and I was the athletics coach at the time. So I got the distance runners down and we looked at them running at slow speeds and fast speeds with and without their shoes. We saw changes in the biomechanics, and that was the first study we ever published on barefoot running. And a lot of it really has just gone from there.
Fascinating story. And it's amazing when you can kind of match your own personal experience and your testimonial with science. And you can see, okay, well, I was feeling this, but now I can actually see the data and I can see why I was feeling that. And this is sort of serves as a good segue into my next question. So in your 2018 study on lower limb running injuries, you stated that running is associated with a higher risk of overuse injuries than other forms of aerobic exercise, such as swimming and cycling. Why is it that running, it's a primal movement pattern, built into our DNA practically. We don't have to learn how to run. It kind of just happens. Whereas with cycling and swimming, these are exercises that need to be taught. What's the discrepancy here? Why is it that we are suffering from injuries with probably our most primal movement pattern?
I think the comparison with those two sports, the main difference is gravity, is the kind of short answer. I guess I use them as a comparison in that scenario to show, I suppose, a comparison with traditionally high volume kind of singular movement type activities. Obviously with gravity and trying to decelerate your body repetitively, there's a much higher musculoskeletal demand in running. Now, why are we so injured if it's in our DNA? Well, there's a couple of things. One is we're a lot more sedentary in the way we live now, and therefore we're not perhaps able to run in the same way that we were before. And then the other side of it is, even though it's in our DNA, it's not in our DNA to set aside an hour a day and smash out 10 kilometers. It's in our DNA to hunt and to gather. So I think the type of running that's been done is different, and I also think the environment is completely different, both in terms of footwear, surface, and daily living.
Okay, so you touched on sedentary behavior, the fact that we sedentary and then moving in this like specific block of time. And then you mentioned shoes, which is a big fascinating topic. We've done a bunch of barefoot shoe reviews. I've been wearing barefoot shoes now for a couple of years. So, can we maybe talk about barefoot shoes a bit? There was the literature review you published this year, and you compared hunter-gatherers to the modern runner, and you described the incompatibility between modern shoe designs and our natural foot function. And you described it as a mismatch between evolutionary biology and cultural evolution. Could you elaborate on what it is about modern footwear that led you to the point to point out this incompatibility?
To link that to our previous point, I think as well that running is a sport very low on movement variability. And what I mean by that is the running we do now. Again, if we were in a hunter-gatherer situation, we would have pace variation, but we would also have regular surface variation. So the amount of variability we're exposed to is a challenge. So, okay, let's link that to your next question then. So if we think about the interior of a shoe, it's very regular. It's very low on variability, you could say. And if we think about a pavement or a road, it's also very regular. The mismatch is sort of like we've got this foot that was engineered and designed with all of these bones and joints that is able to be both stiff and flexible depending on how that terrain is changing underneath our foot. And we then put that into a very regular interior on very regular ground. So now you have a structure that's designed for accomplishing a task, which is running, using multiple different strategies. Now only able to accomplish the task using one strategy. So it's like we're sort of confining and reducing the number of variables all the time. And I think variability is an interesting subject in general, because if you look at variability across all diseases, heart rate variability and so on, when that window gets too narrow, we get into disease states quite easily. So it seems that in our diet and in our footwear and in our exercise habits, variability more often than not is quite good for us. I guess even the fact that humans have thrived is down to genetic variability. So I think the more variability you remove, the sicker the human becomes.
It's an interesting comparison, almost comparing nutrition deficiency to injury. What was interesting you mentioned was that because we've gotten a lot of questions of, people saying, because we're advocates for barefoot shoes, and we presented the fact that, barefoot shoes can alter biomechanics and could perhaps we get better sensory feedback. The foot is allowed to move and function like it's supposed to. And a lot of people have questioned that and said, well, is it really the shoes or is it the surfaces we're running on? As you mentioned, the pavements, the level ground, the lack of variation. But you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned that the shoe itself, the high cushion shoe with arch support, it's a stiff structure that reduces variability in itself. So now you're taking a surface with little variability and you're slapping on a thick, stiff shoe with even less variability, and you're pretty much going to overload the structures that way. So would you say that wearing barefoot shoes in the modern environment, in this concrete jungle we live in, would be a slight improvement over, in terms of just increasing our variability? Because, the sole is allowed to, it does have more flexibility and range of motion. So just by design, even in a modern environment, the foot would still be able to articulate and move a lot more than it would in a stiff and cushioned shoe.
Yeah, I think the challenge is in the question that you've been asked is it the shoe or is it the surface we're running on, or is it the biomechanics, or? And I think what that highlights is perhaps a challenge in society more generally right now is too much of a black and white questioning. So the answer is all of it. And so part of the reason I wrote that review was to try and touch on all of it. rather than to say this is good or this is not. Now, with the cushioned shoe and the heel and so on, well, yes, it makes sense if you hold your calf and Achilles in a shortened position. Muscles and tendons respond to how they're being used. So therefore, that will be an issue to consider when you transition to barefoot shoes. As regards, will there be more variability by wearing a minimalist shoe? Yes, by default. If you can feel more, then you automatically will introduce more variability. I mean, you might have be familiar with in the city where they have those sometimes at zebra crossings there's those studded pieces of footpath. When you wear your minimalist shoes, you can feel those, for example, and so you can feel your toes been moved around a little bit. So yeah, and I think that the studies show that foot muscle size and strength increases just through wearing those shoes. So yes, that will help with that particular issue. The bigger issue of is something good or bad or better or worse then needs another conversation.
Sure. And I mean, with any scientific topic, there's so much nuance, and it's just about not nitpicking or honing in on one, but looking at it holistically and understanding that trying to get as many of these boxes ticked as possible is what collectively it's what's going to really make the difference at the end of the day. And in terms of like the biomechanical changes, another question that gets put out a lot in our videos is that how come marathon runners like Eliad Kipchoge, for example, how come they are able to run pretty much injury-free, break world records, despite wearing maximalist footwear? How would you respond to that question?
Well, I think it's important to remember that most world champion level, world championship level runners, marathon runners, heel strike. So we can approach that question in a few different ways. Well, firstly, I would say if you are a world championship level athlete, by default, you have different musculoskeletal characteristics than the rest of us because you don't reach the world championships without that. Yes, they are in a different bracket. Physiologically, they're in a different bracket in every sense. I've known many talented runners, easily Olympic quality runners in terms of the ability to run, to metabolize, all of that. However, their musculoskeletal system wasn't able to tolerate the training required to get to the level that was needed. So they're in a different bracket. The second thing I'd say about it is who is toward the front of those races. And if we look at that, it's going to be an East African mainly. So then we get into altitude and we get into social issues like the need to escape poverty, and we get into a lot of other issues. However, what we would see is that they would probably grow up barefoot to a large extent, and they would certainly grow up a lot more active than we are. So now we have two things that are advantageous in terms of the musculoskeletal system developing well and the spring system developing well, but also just day to day, the requirement for movement in general means that there's this constant low level musculoskeletal and physiological stimulus. That means by the time they're an adult, I'm sure you could put a pair of welly boots on them and they'll be in pretty good shape, So I think there's a lot of factors in that one.
That's super interesting. And I mean, I've seen videos of his training camp, Eliad, if we can continue talking about Eliad Kipchoge, and it looks like it's a trail running course that he's spinning, it's dirt, it's stones, there's a lot of variation there. And you kind of touched on it. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. And that's the fact that, if one grows up barefoot and they develop all the structures and the favorable biomechanics and movement patterns, perhaps a forefoot strike or, whatever, build up the elastic structures in the Achilles tendon. How important is it to build a foundation, the foot foundation, And how is that protective and preserving of the structures, both from an injury prevention perspective, but possibly even a performance perspective later on in life?
I think it's huge, and I think we don't have enough data in general that follow children over time. We are starting to make that the focus of our research now, more and more. And I guess a really, perhaps even oversimplistic way of explaining it would be, if you change anything in your training too quickly, whether it's a thing that's perceived to be really good for your training or whatever, the rate of change, if it's too sudden, you'll be sore. We've all played a game of football or done a circuit class after a long time off, and we're sore. So what you have to imagine then is, on a bigger level, is if you've been in shoes most of your young life and sitting down, and you decide to be an athlete, that's a very big change. We see, even with, just take bones, the big push is to get your bone mineral density as high as you can by 16, 17, because after that, that's what you've got. That's what you've got to go with, right? So I think that's very, very important in terms of how we develop and what happens later. I wish we had a bit more data on it.
Well, I mean, I read a study published in 2005 in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, and they found that children below the age of 6 who spent 8 hours or more per day in shoes had a significantly higher prevalence of flat feet later in life compared to those who were shod for less hours at a young age. And I found that very interesting. I guess it's a testament to the fact that, what we're doing at a young age, as you mentioned, before our adult years, that, they can determine how we respond to exercise and to physical activity for the rest of our lives. So on our Instagram, we put out a poll and we basically just asked, do you have flat feet? And 52% of the near 1,000 respondents voted yes. So they identify themselves as having flat feet. And I was quite surprised at the number. Do you believe that this is a widespread problem? And do you think that it relates to, wearing shoes when we're young and, not being able to build up those structures properly?
I would be interested to see how many of them actually have flat feet, because many of the changes that we see in arch height and so on are often due to changes occurring due to intrinsic foot muscle weakness. And so therefore, it's not a true flat foot, you could say. I think it's Daniel Lieberman talks about how, if you go back into the archaeological records, there is almost no flat feet. So I wonder whether we do have a high prevalence of flat feet, or whether we do just have those changes. I'm sure there are some people, but it's a bit like leg length discrepancy. You don't see it every day. It's not 52%.
No, and it's obviously an acquired flat foot, or a collapsed arch rather, where the structures are just unable to hold up the arch. All the physical structures are there, they're just not working properly. So that's super interesting. And this is great because we've been talking about barefoot running a lot through our channel, and we actually developed a barefoot shoe transition program dedicated to help people build up their intrinsic foot muscles. We went down a rabbit hole in the literature, and our program takes somebody 6 months to complete, to be able to run their normal distances, in barefoot shoes or completely barefoot. And we've taken that conservative approach because, we see the value in taking your time and reducing the risk of injury. And, this is kind of what's given barefoot running a bad rep over the last few years, because it's been a real trend, going barefoot and using minimalist footwear. But, there's another side that, it gets frowned upon because of the high injury rates, and people putting on a pair of barefoot shoes, going for a 5K run for the first time, and then in excruciating pain for a week afterwards, and being like, no, that's not for me. That, I need to go back to my normal shoes. How important do you feel it is for someone who's, dabbling into barefoot running, bought a pair of minimalistic footwear, to take their time and to build all the intrinsic muscles and build the new movement patterns and new neural connections and everything that goes with, learning something novel and new.
I think the key piece is taking the time. Now, how you do that is there's many options for that. We have a pretty high degree of success with transitioning people to doing some barefoot running on a grass surface. So I live in Ireland and previously in the UK, where we've got a pretty pliable grass surface most of the year because we're never too long without rain. My experience is you can do that quite well, particularly if you can get people to self-select their running speed that's appropriate for them. You keep the dose to 10 or 15 minutes, depending. I've found people can transition quite well to that. Now, that's not to say I do think there is a lot of value in anything that strengthens the muscles and prepares you for activity in general. But something I'm getting more and more interested in as I go along with this stuff is, what if we just change the environment? So sports science and physiotherapy and all of that is great, but I think we have a tendency to dissect all the component parts and then try and put humans back together like a car mechanic, and it looks lovely in theory, and it looks really nice on diagrams and it makes sense intuitively, but I sort of wonder, as monkeys with big brains, if we just got put back into the forest, would we be fine? So I'm open to a slow, gradual walking, running program, on a variable surface that is not man-made, you could say. And I'm open to a strength and conditioning transition. But in both cases, the key is take your time.
For sure. Don't run before you can walk, as they say.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on changing and learning biomechanics? So we know barefoot running, it helps to increase your cadence by shortening your stride length. You naturally move to more of a forefoot striking movement pattern. Your vertical oscillation becomes more tight, and there's less variation there. Or less amplitude rather. So, what is your opinion on also going through some type of technical training, going through specific drills, running drills, working with a metronome, for example, to increase your cadence? Are these things that can be of use as well?
Yeah. One of the things I first loved about barefoot running was you didn't have to coach it, because once the sensory input was there, people just did the right technique. However, I say that, what I should say is most people, or the majority of people, not everybody did. Not everyone adapted in the same way. Maybe 2/3 of people did. So, as relation to the other things, I definitely think they all have a place and they can all help. Certainly with gait retraining, I think you will, if you change the joint positions, by default, you change the muscle work. So yes, I think that has potential to help for sure. But again, it also falls under the umbrella of one component. So it's a little bit like the car mechanic again, where we've adjusted one component, but there's so many others. So yeah, no, I do feel there's potential there, and something I'm asked sometimes when I work with a runner who has a positive transition to barefoot running on grass and is able to tolerate, higher volumes of training than they ever could before. But, maybe they're going away and they're a little bit apprehensive about running in shoes again and so on. I generally tell them to get a pair that's light, comfortable, and cheap. Comfortable because if we listen to ourselves, sometimes, and something feels instinctively comfortable, that's not always a bad sign. Too light because they can then transfer their barefoot running form into their shoes, and cheap because there's no point in spending money on nonsense. So yeah, I think those things, particularly in urban environments, can be part of the strategy.
It's interesting. It calls to mind the case study you did on the lady with plantar fasciitis, and how
Yeah.
only once she had started barefoot running, and you'd removed that sort of obstruction, did her pain completely dissipate. So it's fascinating when you say that, what's the beauty behind barefoot running is that you don't really need to coach it. All these favorable changes happen by themselves. And, as soon as you move the obstruction, you move the obstacle, the body kind of by default knows where to go, and it kind of just finds its way. We just got to let the body remove everything and just let the body free and just let it do its thing,
Yeah.
How do you know how do you know how to find that balance, when you're trying to navigate your training and your coaching as well? How do you do it with your athletes?
I think it's amazing when you can get out of your head and into your body, the wisdom that's there. It's amazing. Most people, they know, um, they know. With even clinically, just with injuries in general, I always work with someone and say, right, we're going to problem solve this together, because you need an external voice to help you do that. But usually it's their information I'm using to help them solve their problem. So we might identify a list of things that aggravate the problem, and we might say, okay, that's really useful information now because we know what makes it worse. And then we might identify a list of things that make it better. Okay, that's really useful information because we know that. And so, sometimes when, you mentioned that case report, what I said to that person was, right, well, we've loaded it now, which is the worst thing we could do, really. And we've got three options. This gets worse. In other words, that was a very bad idea. It stays the same, which means even though we've been quite aggressive with what we've done, it hasn't got any worse. In other words, it's worth further consideration, or in a best case scenario, it gets better. So in terms of knowing where that line is, it's myself, I think deep down, you get to know where it is. But when I'm working with people, a lot of my answers to them are somewhat simple and boring and uncomplicated, because often they have the information. I think in general, maybe again, a flaw in our field is the drive towards precise metrics and what they mean. And I think all of that falls apart when you start working with a real person, So yeah, there's not a hard and fast rule for it, but when somebody's tired, they know they're tired. When somebody's sore, they know they're sore. So it's kind of working it that way. So sometimes you can push people because the thing that they're worried about is not actually real. In that case, you can say, okay, let's try a little bit of this. I know you're worried, but let's try a little bit of this. And then you start to build their confidence of, oh, I can do this. So sometimes there is a little bit of that, but that's why you need your external voice, I guess.
For sure. And I mean, we often fall victim to the paralysis by analysis, especially, with, I'm a sports scientist as well. So, with the background, always having to, find some literature to back up everything that you are thinking about. We kind of, we get into that very mathematical mindset. That's kind of what drew me into barefoot running, was the fact that for the first time I was starting to use my sense of touch. I was able to feel the ground and know, okay, well, when I bash my heel into the ground barefoot running, it's painful, so I ought to stop doing that. And automatically I adjust into more of a sort of mid to forefoot striking pattern, and then the pain dissipates and I'm like, my brain's like, okay, great, that's much better. And that's not something that you need books to teach you. It's intuitive. You feel it, you get this pain shooting up your leg, and you just know, okay, this is not the right thing. And that's amazing for me. It kind of makes you feel like you're on the right path, because you're using all your senses. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think that if you are a runner nowadays, you are information overloaded from all angles, and you lose touch with your own ability to listen to your body. So I think that's important. But I also think something you said is interesting about, even as a sports scientist, and you're trying to back up what you're saying. You know, I think we forget sometimes that all ideas have to come from somewhere. So it's fine having studies that have established something and then variants of those same studies. But if we just did that, we'd have no new ideas. So, and again, something I find in conversation, I say a lot to people is, don't forget, a PhD means Doctor of Philosophy. You've got to be able to think, you've got to be able to use your own mind. And so early in my career, I never would have published a case report, because I would have thought, well, oh, that's only just one person, and that's rubbish, and whatever. But actually, the seeds for the best studies I've ever done are when I'm thinking about what it is I'm doing and why. And we've got some more exciting data with bigger numbers to come on that plantar fasciitis study. But my favorite study ever is the one I did in New Zealand, where one day I was just looking out the window of my office, and I noticed all the kids ran on the hard track with no shoes, and I thought, wow, I didn't think they could do it on the hard track. And so then we just designed a study ad hoc and got in touch with the school and did the study, and it's off the top of my head, it's like, science was supposed to be, I wonder why, the apple falls from the tree, so again, I think we've over intellectualized science to the point that it's sort of dying in boxes, you know what I mean, in terms of things that are already known and done are done and done and done, because it's safe science, I suppose. It's not to say that you keep an open mind, not so that your brain falls out on the table, but that you stay open to things you don't know yet.
Definitely, not to put yourself in a straitjacket with
Yeah.
of references and and citations.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And in talking about case studies, one of the case studies that I'll never forget reading was one on a triathlete who kept on getting hamstring cramps. And after identifying that the glutes were not responding properly and the hamstrings were sort of taking the role of the glutes as the primary hip extender, they went on a glute retraining protocol, got the glutes firing again, and the triathlete's hamstring pain and discomfort disappeared. What is your opinion on the connection between the glutes and the feet?
I think the first thing is to talk about the case study. So what we have to remember with case studies is that there are so many possible explanations there. So number one, the fact that I'm getting a treatment at all may completely rewire my physiology in a positive way. Number two, I've introduced a new stimulus when I do a new treatment. Number three, maybe there is something in the glute situation. Number four, maybe the person who is doing it with me, I believe in them. So I think it's important to use these things to ask questions, but to stay wide on our explanations, because it could be a whole bunch of things. And then, are the glutes linked to the ankles? It's a bit like saying, are the eyes linked to your ankles? It's like, of course they are, because the whole thing is one. So with the glutes and the ankle link, it's a little bit, dissecting things again, because what we see is when you get the sensory input to the feet, the lower limb biomechanics change. So the ankle, the knee, the hip, everything changes. So we could draw lines between all of those things, but I think we probably need to get a little bit more into whole system thinking. I mean, one of my favorite analogies is, you know, we can study how birds fly, and we can, and I'm sure thousands of people have done PhDs on the exact physics and how all of that works and stuff. But you don't then line all the birds up on the wall and say, the thing you're doing wrong with your flying is this, you know, they just know how to fly, right? Now, you know, maybe their left wing is giving them a bit more than their right one, but it doesn't matter because they're able to fly, right? So I think what we need to do that with ourselves a little bit now, in terms of how we're moving. And I'm not to say that there's not merit, you know, in if I do a glute intervention. Of course, the sideways facing pelvis is what allowed us to stand upright and to walk and to run, and therefore, you know, those muscles that connect our torso to our legs, of course, are important. And we see when people transition well to barefoot running, these muscles switch on more. So yeah, they're definitely relevant, as are all the other muscles on the way down.
Definitely. The study that you did, where you found knee injuries to be the most common amongst runners, regardless of gender. You know, why do you think that is? Why are the knees sort of bearing the brunt of our running?
I think we can go back to some of the start on this in terms of running mechanics are definitely an issue. Our level of conditioning is definitely an issue. I think the knee is particularly interesting in that when our ability to decelerate our body effectively, whether that's from a jump in field sports or running, when that's compromised, we tend to see knee issues. And sometimes that could be like a traumatic ACL ligament injury, and sometimes it's like patellofemoral pain syndrome. And I do feel the hips and the glute muscles are big players in that, because they control the femoral movement. So I think because we are more seated more often, I think our posterior chain is not working in a way that it once did. But it still works, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to walk or run or do anything, right? So it still works. But I think maybe the balance between anterior and posterior and the coordination between the two systems is a little bit off. And I think with an extended lower limb that relies primarily on quadriceps for stability, we are going to run into knee issues in that case.
Okay, so quad dominance definitely exacerbates our issue, and you know, perhaps focusing on the posterior chain, getting those glutes more activated. Talking about that, how much do you think reciprocal inhibition is to play here, i.e. tight hip flexors, tight rectus femoris, you know, inhibiting the glute function? How much do you think that plays a role, you know, due to all the sitting that we're doing all day long and being chronically tight on these anterior structures?
Yeah, I mean, even in what I said to you a second ago, I find myself disagreeing with myself at the same time, in terms of, I understand the concept and I agree with the concept, for example, of quad dominance. However, if somebody listens to that, it sounds like they should kind of exterminate their quads and fire up their glutes, and I don't think that's quite right either. I mean, the calf and the quads, when we transition to upright movement, are the prime drivers of the forward momentum, and the glutes are the stabilizers that allow us to hop from one leg to the other. So again, I think what we probably need to start doing is talking about how do we achieve coordinated human movement, because even in the perfect runner, quads are really important muscle. You know, we really need them, and sometimes I feel when these conversations don't have enough nuance, we kind of leave everybody going home stretching their quads like mad and trying to fire up their glutes, when maybe if we just put up a mirror and taught them good landing mechanics, then all the muscles would fix themselves, because if you get the joints in the right position, then the muscles have no choice, you know.
So thinking about movement first and kind of letting the body take care of itself.
Well, you've no choice, though. You cannot get into certain positions otherwise, you know.
For sure, for sure. So, for example, maybe, you know, if you see someone is lacking hip extension, focus on hip extension. If you see somebody with a toed out foot position, you know, try and work on a little bit of internal rotation.
Maybe, but
maybe.
Actually, yes, in terms of you know, practice the movement that you want to achieve, for sure. But even if we take the foot external rotation, does it matter? So let's say we've got a world championship runner with 2 externally rotated feet who has never been injured. We're not going to change that, you know? So again, that's what we got to be careful with, is maybe or maybe not, you know? Like, so it's like, if somebody's fine, then they're a bird that's flying, you know? So it's like they don't need our intervention. But maybe, yeah, if somebody's having a lot of trouble, and maybe their activities of daily living mean they're in a lot of sustained postures, you know, that's having an impact, then okay, how do we break up those sustained postures? You know, what kind of a movement program can we introduce? Yeah, definitely in that scenario. But I think a thing we're very guilty of in this field, again, is given the label of your feet are like this. And that's a big problem, because all of this stuff is not just physical, it's psychological as well. So, you know, you get a label of, oh, I've got a degenerative this. It's very hard to undo that when somebody gets that label. It takes a lot of work to undo that. It took me about 10 years to undo it. So I think that's another big thing we're guilty of, is in attributing meaning to very natural variation, you know. When we go back in evolutionary times, we didn't all have the exact same bones and symmetric, perfect, you know, we just accomplished tasks. So some of us did that with a bit more arm strength, and some of us did it with a bit more leg strength, but essentially there's lots of ways to do things. So yeah, I think that's another little sin of our profession. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, for example, I see it a lot with squatting. You know, should you deep squat? Well, some people just don't have the structures to squat. If they've got the so-called Scottish hip, you know, you're just not able to hit the depth. You know, your hip sockets made more for rotation and sort of upright movements. And getting down, you know, like the Polish, getting down deep in asks of the grass is just not the way that you're wired. So does that mean that you should, you know, be practicing trying to deep squat, or, you know, perhaps understand that we do have variation structurally, and perhaps just play to your strengths. And as you say, if it's not broken, there's no real need to fix it. But, you know, on the flip side, should we wait for something to happen? Should we wait for something to break before we think, oh, okay, maybe now it's time that we should intervene? Or, you know, when do we say, okay, well, perhaps I could improve this? Because, you know, on one side, yes, you know, we sort of passionate, for the lack of the better word, of trying to get people out of pain and what have you, but we're also chasing performance, because performance is cool. Everybody wants to perform better. So if you can take an athlete that is the world's best and make him the world's greatest, you know, is that wrong? It's a tough conversation, and I think we could probably spend the next 2 days talking about that. But maybe you have something interesting to respond.
I think 3 things: science, the individual, and trade-offs. So where I would be frustrated is sometimes we assess things that have no predictive basis. So in that scenario, we have to weigh up what is the cost of measuring this in this person and telling them that information versus the benefit. So we've got to be pretty sure that whatever it is we're doing will deliver over and above the cost of introducing new information. I think sometimes another thing we forget in this profession is that everything has a negative consequence. Everything. So even if it's the best intervention ever, as soon as I give you something new to accommodate, I've disrupted your rhythm. So you have to then make space in your head to accommodate that. So my intervention must be therefore good enough to overcome the backward step and add further on to the next forward step. And I think that's where the idea of trade-offs comes in terms of really thinking about that and really thinking about what is the potential negative side to all of this. And then the thing with science is sometimes it shows us really well. Like, I think there's more and more data coming along to show that, landing mechanics programs in female soccer, can lower rates of injury. Therefore, is it wise to introduce those movements into warm-ups? Yeah, sounds good to me. That sounds pretty sound. Now, interestingly, even if we do that, if that coach changes their training load too quickly, then all of our injury prevention warm-ups won't matter anyway. So it's like, can we zoom out a little bit and then work out the trade-offs and then intervene? So it's not that we're avoiding or we're waiting for something bad to happen before we intervene. I think we're being a little bit more humble about how certain we can be in our predictions for an individual, because I don't think we can be that certain.
Gotcha. Yeah, I said I'm a keen golfer, and I grew up playing golf my whole life, and I saw it so many times. A professional, major winner decides, he needs a new swing, starts working with a new swing coach, and then you don't hear of him for 10 years. And, it's like, why? Because he thought maybe, whatever. Tiger Woods, it happened to him. He had 4 back surgeries, and, obviously the swing he had was putting way too much stress on his spine. But it took him almost a decade, and that man's super mentally tough, and he's got that drive and that inner desire to just do it no matter what. And maybe if it was anyone else, you just would never have heard of them again. 100%. One thing I wanted to mention, just to close off a previous open-ended question I had was, in terms of the knee injuries. So you mentioned how the glutes could be a culprit, not keeping the femur aligned, and maybe there's a bit of a valgus or whatever. How much do you think the downstream part of that could be affecting the knees as well? Sort of collapsed arches, overpronation. So, you've got a joint that's sitting in between the hips and the feet, and both dysfunction downstream or upstream could be affecting that joint. Do you think that might be a reason why knee injuries are so high in runners?
For sure. I think it can work. I think it can work downstream, and I think it can work in the opposite direction. However, if we were barefoot and, hunting and gathering, would we have strong Achilles tendons and feet muscles? Yes. Would we have functioning glute muscles? Yes. Functioning quads, functioning yes. So I do think those things are interrelated, but sometimes it can be hard to pick out, does that one go downstream and cause that, or does this one start downstream and cause this? My instinct would be a bit of both, to be honest.
Definitely. So, going away from specifics, zooming out, and, if you had to give some type of blanket recommendation to everybody, what would you, I know I've got to be very careful with that question. What would you say? Get out of your shoes and just move in as many different ways as you can, constantly vary your movement. What kind of advice would you give?
Well, you mentioned Tiger Woods, and taking 10 years. So it took me 10 years from being an injury prone runner to being able to run for 3 years consistently and run some PBs. And what I had to do was sort of forget everything I knew in terms of norms, like running norms, which is generally high volumes of running and so on. And I needed to create a program that worked for me where I was right now. So it's a little bit like accepting the present moment, in terms of this is where I am, and then making a list of things I needed to do in order to improve, to be better than I was yesterday. And that sort of step at a time approach, got me 8 weeks of training. And once I got 8 weeks of training and I raced and I got a bit better, then I did another 8 weeks of training. So along that journey, I wrote loads of blogs on how to do all of that. You can read them all on peterfrancis.blog under the Running from Injury tab. But the question you asked there is a really good one, because you're right. If I'm teaching a class, I sort of don't like that question, but I understand it. Okay. I always feel that if I've done a good enough job, whoever it is should be empowered enough to be able to work it out. However, I do accept that we all need a little bit of structure to get us moving sometimes, right? So what I've just done there is I pulled up the PowerPoint from my running from injury talk, and the very last slide is, so what do I do now? And there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things on it that I'll just shoot to you, which hopefully will answer the question. So design a variable program where no 2 days are the same. Think about the volume of running you can do comfortably. Try to do it for 8 to 10 weeks. Keep a spreadsheet of your training whereby it's easy to see what you have been doing. Engage in some form of strength and conditioning. Incorporate 10 to 15 minutes of easy barefoot running on grass a couple of times per week. At least once a week, run as fast as you can, if possible, up a hill. And then lastly, make the headspace to run. So what that means is, if you want to get better at something, you got to make enough time for it. You can't really be sprinting from the office to the running group at 7 o'clock and then sprinting down back to have your dinner. And you've got to make a bit of headspace to be able to be in a good state of mind to get better at something. So those were just a list of things, and you'll see they're all very generic, they're all very broad. And what that allows the individual to do is a variable program. So they can say, well, I live beside a yoga studio. Great, I'll use that. But it means the guy who doesn't live beside a yoga studio can, but he lives beside a park with a load of hills in it. Well, he can use that. So it helps people to think in their environment, what are my options? A lot of my training was based on situational convenience, because that was the thing that gave me enough headspace. If I had to drive 2 hours to get to the special gym, then the special gym was sending me backwards, not forwards. So hopefully that answers it a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to nitpick just a little here. You mentioned running as fast as you can uphill. Why uphill and not on a straight surface?
Okay, so one thing I noticed was, if you squat, if you sprint, if you run up a hill, and if you run barefoot, all 4 of those things have something in common, and that is flexion of your hip, knee, and your ankle. And therefore, you must eccentrically use your muscles to control those movements. The running as fast as you can thing is partly to do with that, and it's also partly to remind you of what you're capable of. I think a lot of people begin to fear a void when they feel they're not very fit, they're not very conditioned, they're injury prone. And something that was great for me was, no matter what little niggles I had, when I was sprinting up that hill as fast as I could once a week, I knew my body worked just fine. And so, you know, everything in the talk I do is, it's half physical and half mental. You know, that maybe the biggest thing I learned was that you can't separate those two things. You know,
Definitely. And you know, it's also, you know, from a physiological perspective, I think it mimics very much our hunter-gatherer ancestors who, you know, had these, you know, bouts of exercise that were super high intensity, and it's something that we lack these days. So, and just to finish off this conversation, you know, talking about the mental aspect, how do you sort of help your athletes get into the right frame of mind, build the confidence, and sort of inspire them to be able to, you know, be consistent with their training and, you know, continuously have the courage and that confidence to, you know, to get out there every day and train? Especially people who are, as you say, prone to injury, you know, who have been fighting injury, maybe whether it be back or knee, whatever it may be.
I think the biggest thing with success in anything is consistency. Everybody wants to be consistent, but few master it. And what I would try to do with people is to get them into where they are now rather than where they want to be. And if you can get a level of acceptance there, that's important. The other thing is, I would get them to change their mindset from a runner, a footballer, a rugby player, whatever it is they do, to an athlete. Because an athlete can improve multiple components of fitness and get better. Whereas if I am only a runner and I can't run, I have now lost my entire identity. Whereas when I made my more successful comeback, there was yoga, there was circuit training, there was plyometrics, there was sprinting up a hill, there was long runs and threshold runs and track runs and stuff. But I was a lot more of an athlete in training. In other words, if I ran into trouble with the running component of my program, I had somewhere to go, because I would just switch to cross trainer or switch to whatever I needed to do. And when that niggle was gone the following week, which it invariably is if you stop, you know, in time, I would just then return to normal. So I would say to people, decide on the goal, make a deal with yourself that you will, whatever training you are able to do now, you will do a block of it without increasing it too quickly. Just make a promise to yourself that you will stay with that. Then you will see how little you have to do to get better, provided it's consistent. And then when people begin to see that, that doubles their buy-in to the process, because they believe now, wow, all I did was this, but I did it for 8 weeks and I'm so much better than I was 8 weeks ago. And that will help them to delay gratification, which is really the enemy in this kind of drive towards consistency. The other thing is that by having more variable training strategies, that helps you delay gratification as well. Because if you're tempted to do an extra run, instead you can say, well, I'll do an extra something else. And so that stops you kind of overindulging in any one aspect of training. So yeah, slow and steady, accept where you are now, stay open to training in a different way, try not get sucked in by what other people are doing, all of those things. Another thing I would do is deliberately create opportunities for them to see the progress. And even if that's just to see themselves that they can sprint up a hill, you know, anything that shows them what's possible, like us all, it increases our buy-in, you know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, not always doing, you know, the exercises that you're most weak at, but sometimes doing the things that you're good at too, giving you that confidence and that reminder that, hey, you're not that bad. You still have, you know, working limbs. Dr. Francis, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been a very enlightening conversation, and I hope you enjoyed having a conversation with us. I was lovely meeting you.
My pleasure.
And hopefully we can do it again sometime when in the near future. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? Your website, your Twitter?
So peterfrancis.blog is a good one for all the runners who want to read about, on that, there's a lot about how to put together the 7 days of training and, in a way that works in real life when you've got to go to work and stuff like that. So they can find that there. Instagram is @runningfrominjury. My Twitter is probably the main one I use, particularly with putting out the latest science and so on. And that's @PeterFrancis_IE. And hopefully next year, the book Running from Injury will come out, which basically is in 2 sections. First section is why do runners get injured, and the second section is how do we fix it. And it tries to take a very broad, zoomed out, nuanced, integrated way to package it together in a way that by the time you read the first half of the book, I'm hoping you'll kind of know the answers in the second half of the book. So yeah.
Wow. Well, hopefully we can do another interview when that book's out, and that'll be awesome.
Cheers.
That's it from us today. Thanks for watching our debut podcast episode with Dr. Peter Francis. I'm your host, Chris, and until next time, cheers.